So we saw a lot of Ohio State spring practice last spring, and by the end of the spring, we were of the opinion that the offensive line had a long way to go. Well, today Ohio State was bringing a lot of pressure on defense, a lot of blitzes, but also they just have a strong defensive line that was getting some pressure, and it made things tough at times on the quarterbacks again. And it's one of the things that we've been watching is like, what kind of progress did this offensive line make from last spring to this spring, since it is largely the same group of guys. So, Steven, as you looked today, you were watching the offense mostly, so you got that perspective of it. But did you come out of today thinking this was an indication of how much farther the offensive line has to go, or that this defensive front is even more advanced maybe than it was a year ago?
It's more the offensive line, because I know the defensive line is good. And we've had this, I think we've done this video, Nathan, 3 years in a row now, where it's like we come out of this and the defensive line looks like it's the most terrorizing thing on the planet. And then we go, okay, you did it in the spring, but can you do it in fall? And then the answer is no, I didn't really do it in fall. We did it every so often, but we didn't do it all the time. That's how I come out of this with the defensive line. This is cool. Do it on Saturdays, man. You got potential first rounders all over the place. Do it on Saturdays. The offensive line, and I even asked Ryan Day about it, they're moving guys around everywhere, so there wasn't really a ones versus twos. I think the one thing I'm very confident about at this point is Donovan Jackson's your left guard, Joshua Simmons is your left tackle, and Seth McLaughlin, who lost his black stripe today, is your center, because those three were always together, but the right side was everybody you can think of. And really, even early on in the practice, when they were really mixing and matching, we saw Austin Sierevelt move up there with the ones at some point. So it's still kind of all over the place. But listen, man, in some ways, I've said this before, if you had to list off the reasons why they lost to Michigan, on that list is the offensive line fell apart at the end there. On the list of the reasons they lost the Cotton Bowl, the offensive line failed at the end of that game here. So the defensive line is going to be, at worst, an A- this year. But this offensive, now, it wasn't as bad as it was last year in terms of them getting dominated, but Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau are just annoying. But I do think if they feel like they've got the options in the room, which they didn't have last year, then there just needs to be continued growth over the next 6 months. Because if that's the case, we can look back on this and be like, oh, in 2022, Paris Johnson was getting his butt whipped, but he was an All-American, came the fall. I don't think there's a Paris Johnson in here, but there's a step below that, I think, is where they can get to. And so that's where the defensive line, cool. Offensive line, you can't let what this defensive line is doing to you in the spring happen to you in fall camp, let alone on Saturdays once the season starts.
I'm reminded almost of a dynamic that I actually just wrote about it that Jim Knowles talked about going into last year, which was when he was evaluating the cornerbacks in 2022, and that wide receiver room was like so far ahead that sometimes you were like, well, I guess that's as good as the DBs can do, and that can't be the standard. And I'm not saying that is the standard, but I think that Justin Fry and his staff and the rest of this offensive staff need to be taking that same approach, because the Cotton Bowl is what skewed things, because we thought progress had been made, and then that was just a collapse. And so that put the pressure back on, put the microscope back on this offensive line group for this spring. And Andrew, you weren't here last spring, so you were even asking us like, hey, was it this bad last spring? And we were like, yep. At times it was even worse than this, because today I thought they could run a functional offense pretty consistently today. There were some moments that went bad, but largely they were able to get the ball downfield and like do drives. I mean, there were times last spring where that wasn't even the case. So I think I would maybe even still lean that maybe this is just the defensive front, the talent, 4 returning starters, plus Edric Houston looked really good today in our first extended look at him, true freshman. They were bringing C.J. Hicks a lot on blitzes. That's a guy who is like made for that role probably. So I would maybe lean more on just how great the defensive line is, and the offensive line can still get there. You were watching the defense. How did you, if you had to pick, even if it's 51-49 on those two, what's your lean?
Well, it's because the defense is so good. Because I mentioned this on a pod that, you know what, like there's just a lot of guys that are in the middle of that defense. I thought Will Smith Jr. looked really explosive today. I thought he made a lot of plays. Jason Moore, Hiru Kanu looked good. Jason Moore stood out. I think Hiru had one of the safeties that was in this end zone. Like, this defense is just really good. However, I don't care when you're talking about the offensive line, because this is a team that wants to win a national championship. This isn't a team that wants to go 9-3 or wants to make it to the Big Ten championship. This isn't Wisconsin. Do you not think you're going to play a player of JT Tuimoloau's level at some point? Like, JT Tuimoloau, I made a joke with the other writers as I was walking down here. Everybody else was watching 7-on-7. I went, all right, guys, I'm going to go watch real football, and I'm going to watch some one-on-one offensive line, defensive line drills. Nobody on the offensive line could touch JT Tuimoloau. It was a spin move, and it was over. Tegra Shabola couldn't touch him. He got toasted one time. Josh Fryer got toasted one time, and I'm like, there's a non-insane world. That's your starting right side. And I understand JT Tuimoloau was great. I understand he's a fourth-year player. I understand he's a highly rated recruit. I understand he's like looking at a first-round draft pick. Like, I understand all of those things. Are there not going to be first-round draft picks on your schedule? Are there not going to be JT Tuimoloau's and Jack Sawyers and Tyleik Williams on your schedule? So Ohio State's defensive line is really good. I'm not saying that Ohio State's offensive line needs to come out and just dominate them and just look like the Hogs back in the day and just, we're just going to run the ball. We're going to tell you where we're running the ball, and you're not going to be able to stop it. I'm not saying you have to do that, but you have to be able to stand up to these guys at some point. And the offensive line is going to have to come together at some point. So yeah, I think the reason is when you look at all these things, I see the defensive line is just really good. They've just got a lot of players that would start at a lot of different places. You got two dudes who could be getting drafted in 3 weeks. I get it. But that's not an excuse to me. Like that, or it shouldn't be a big excuse to me, because the offensive line is going to have to block players of that caliber at some point. And if you can't do it now, and you couldn't do it last year, and if you can't do it in fall camp, why should I be confident that you're going to do it against Iowa, against Oregon, against Penn State, against Alabama and Georgia if you make it to college football playoff, like in that level and you play those teams? Why? I don't know. So to me, it's the defensive line, but I just look at the offensive line and be like, I need more. I need more out of these guys right now.
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing to say, especially, again, because of there was supposed to be a year of progress, and I don't know if that showed up as much today. I will say, again, it's four guys who would be getting drafted in a couple weeks. It's like all 4 of those guys who came back would be getting drafted, and Andrew Houston's going to get drafted someday, and that's not even mentioning some of the other, like Kenyatta Jackson, Caden Curry. I asked Kenyatta Jackson earlier this week, hey, like that was the dynamic last spring, offensive line versus defensive line. What's it been like this spring? Because we haven't watched much practice. And he said that the offensive line was still kind of having to figure out some things in terms of some things Chip Kelly is changing. And so, okay, like benefit of the doubt there. They do have a little bit of an adjustment period, but there's going to be an adjustment to be made in every game you play to some extent because of what the other team you've got to make those adjustments. You've got to adapt. And I think it is fair to say that this offensive line does have more progress to be made here only halfway through the spring. We'll talk about this more on Buckeye Talk, and get the text 614-350-3315 news analysis updates every day from cleveland.com.